You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple.
Welcome to Sweet Talk, all things maple. I'm Aaron Whiteman, co-director of the Cornell Maple Program. Joining me is my colleague and co-host, Adam Wild. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Aaron. It is great to be back on Sweet Talk. It has been a while since we talked. What have you been up to lately?
As you know, this is always a busy time of year with classes to teach on campus and grant reports to write. But I did recently have a chance to get out to Cattaraugus County for a workshop at the Cooperative Extension Office, and it was a beautiful autumn day. I took the back roads through the hills to enjoy the beautiful forest landscape, and it was really nice.
That's great to hear. As you know, Aaron, I grew up in that area, and I agree that it is a beautiful part of the state with lots of forest land and lots of maple trees.
Yeah, definitely lots of beautiful sugar maples and other maples through the hills. And I'm glad you brought that up, Adam, because forests and trees are what I want to talk about on today's show. Healthy forests and trees are a resource we sugar makers cannot do without. And with all the uncertainty and change in the natural world, it's important that we have the forestry knowledge and tools to react to that change.
That's right, Aaron. One option we have as sugar makers is to tap a number of different maple species to make syrup. As our listeners probably know, any acer species can be tapped for syrup production, but not all maple trees are the same in terms of, their sap and sugar production and what conditions they grow best in. So having a variety of species to tap allows for syrup production in a variety of ecosystem and climate conditions.
Yeah, the importance of diversity in a sugar bush really can't be overstated. That definitely means thinking about having non-maple species in the woods. But in addition, we have a number of different maple species in the woods with adaptations to different growing conditions that can bring diversity to the productive part of the sugar bush. Now, one that we don't hear much about is Freeman's maple, which is a hybrid of silver maple and red maple. To find out more, I reached out to Professor Gabe Karns at Ohio State University to talk about his Freeman's Maple research project.
I have actually planted a few of the Freeman maples at the Eline Forest and tapped at a young age, so I'm really curious to find out what they have learned from their research. So let's go ahead and have a listen.
Greetings, Sweet Talk listeners. Thanks for tuning in to what I think will be an especially interesting talk with Dr. Gabriel Karns on the topic of a tree we don't hear a lot about, and that's Freeman's maple. Gabe is a visiting assistant professor at Ohio State University in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, and for the past few years, he's been engaged in maple research. Hi, Gabe.
How are you, Aaron?
Doing well. How are you?
Fantastic. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. We're really grateful for your time today.
Yeah, delighted. The more that we can share our research as researchers, that generally scratches an itch that we have.
Yeah, that's the purpose of this show, is to get the word out on all this research that's happening. But before we get into the maple research, I wonder if I can ask a little bit more about your background, because I suspect most sugar makers don't know you. So can you tell us a little bit about your background, what your big research interests are, and things like that?
I suppose I will, right off the bat, out myself as a bit of an imposter in the maple space. The reason most sugar makers don't know about me is because up until about 5 years ago, maple was as much a part of my professional portfolio as most people who eat maple syrup globally. I was a consumer, not a producer, and not remotely interested in knowing much more about where it came from or how I could investigate that process further. And the reason for that is, classically, I'm trained as a wildlife ecologist. That's still sort of the bedrock, the foundation of who I am professionally. And it absolutely does also color how I approach the sugar bush in terms of co-viewing that landscape as, I wonder what sorts of wildlife occupy this space as well, knowing that sugar makers have a somewhat complicated relationship with wildlife depending on, which critter we're talking about.
That's true.
I know we all love squirrels.
That's true. I think we're all keenly aware that the sugar bush is also the home to a lot of critters, some we love and some we love to hate.
Absolutely.
And if you don't mind my saying so, I also detect the Southern accent. We don't hear a lot of Southern accents in the maple industry. Does that have anything to do with your relative recent arrival on the maple scene?
For sure. I was born in Northwest Pennsylvania, within about an hour of where the Lake Erie Maple Expo is hosted annually, but that is not the region of the country that I call home. South and North Carolina, north predominantly being where I quote, grew up, moved to Alabama to complete a doctorate, and then have been here in Columbus, Ohio at Ohio State for the last 11 years.
Wow, those are all beautiful parts of the country. And I'll just chime in that I went to forestry school in the South, so it holds a special place in my heart. And those forests down there are a place that I really love to spend time.
Wholeheartedly agree. It's always fun to go home and see some longleaf pine and the other really interesting forest communities that we don't have around here locally. But I will add this. At Ohio State, our director at the time, there was an opportunity came up for someone to step up and become involved in maple who previously had not. At that time, there were no obvious candidates, so it was sort of an awkward silence. Who's going to raise their hand first? In a personal light, I love to do things like forage and garden and cook and hunt and fish. And there's a lot of motivations that sort of leverage down on those activities. But one is, personally, I don't think it's possible to eat anything other than just good food if you don't know the story behind it. One of my favorite things to say is the only gateway to great food is good food with an accompanying story. Only then does it qualify to be great. The process of tapping a tree and extracting something not only edible but deliciously edible kind of fit into some personal interests of mine, and professionally was probably the nudge that I needed to say yes.
Wow, that's a really interesting avenue to approach maple from. That's really interesting connective tissue, that wildlife ecology background coupled with a food ethic. And I think that's really, that might not sound like it's right down the pipeline for maple, but in a lot of ways it is, because we're making food in an hopefully intact and well-managed forest ecosystem. So I think that's great that you've been doing this work. So yeah, let's get right into your project. I just touched on it a little bit, that you were looking at Freeman's maple, but can you give us kind of the big picture of what Freeman's maple is and what your project is?
Absolutely. So when we think about the different maple species that someone may encounter on the landscape, we typically think sugar maple, red maple, silver maple, maybe a black maple or two if you're lucky, box elder if you want to include that in the maple category. But most of those responses come from a woodlot perspective. When one goes into a woodlot, one is not necessarily looking for Freeman's maple. And the reason for that is that Acer freemanii, this red silver cross that's been around just over about 90 years now, is predominantly an urban street tree with some very popular cultivars that are beautiful in their own right. But up until recently, most dendrologists, most foresters weren't looking for it in a natural woodlot because presumably it wasn't there.
Right. So the Freeman's maples that people knew about were intentionally crossed hybrids that had been bred to be a cultivar that could be planted as a street tree.
That's exactly right. Essentially in the 30s, Oliver Freeman, actually someone with roots back to North Carolina. So maybe there's some divine narrowing of paths that have collided here. That hybrid came out of the National Arboretum, was bred at one of the Forest Service research stations to a provenance that included things like autumn blaze. And if you Google Acer freemanii and sort of its highlights, its good elements, you'll basically see in assemblage of words that says it's the best of both red and silver. Silver's the fastest growing maple tree. It grows explosively fast. I would argue fall foliage of red maple is more attractive on average than silver maple. It showcases red. But if you get the best of a silver maple's growth rate, hopefully you do not get the growth form and relatively brittle structure of a silver maple, and you don't. You get red maple's flavor of stronger wood and absolutely better growth form. So it really is sort of in its arboretal, artificial breeding environment, a best of both worlds. And that's the reason why it's become such a popular arboriculture option.
Yeah, and I can see why those same characteristics might lead to some strong interest from the maple sugar production perspective. But I'm guessing there's more to the story here, because one thing I note as a forester, and I admit that I cheated a little bit and pulled out my old Silvix manual and read about both of these species and saw that one thing they share in common is a flowering time. So their flowers are out very early in the year. So I'm guessing we're going to hear a little bit about natural hybrids next, naturally occurring hybrids.
Precisely. When we're in the woods in Ohio, and one part of my appointment is that I get to play the role of land manager for one of our regional campuses within the Ohio State constellation. That campus being Ohio State Mansfield, which is in the north central portion of the state, Richland County. That campus is about 700 acres, only about 40 of which are sidewalks, parking lots, building, other impervious surface. So we have this big playground. That playground is the teaching and extension hub for our state's Woodland Stewards program. And it's also the location where I teach our forestry and wildlife capstone course during the month of May. So as we're teaching capstone, which is operated sort of like a pop-up consultancy, we have students, they have varying skill sets. The campus has management needs or questions. We assemble groups around those. They do an intense amount of work in 3 weeks. They share a report back to a campus committee, and we use that report to then guide management into the future to be better stewards of that landscape. 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, some students that inventoried the mature forest, we somewhat haphazardly erected, older than 75 years, but younger than 125 years is sort of our mature forest classification. And these students noted that there's some sugar maples and tons of red maples on campus. We've had foresters on campus. You have a nice mix of red and sugar maples. We've taught tree identification workshops in the past. And we teach black maple and red maple and silver maple because we have a couple of those planted, and definitely lots of sugar maple. And it wasn't until we started looking at some leaves and asking some other folks, hey, yeah, maybe I was looking at a dendrology guide. This doesn't quite look like the quintessential red maple leaf. But it's also not deeply dissected enough. The lobes aren't distinct enough to really tell me it's silver maple. Could it be both?
Uh-huh.
Could it be both? Start noticing some interesting whirling patterns, sort of a bullseye impression on some of the bark, on some of the trees that are in more hydric sites, those trees having a bit wetter feet. And the wheels are really turning at this point. And the thing to do at that point is take some samples and ask that question from a genetic standpoint, not looking at what it looks like, but asking truly, what is it comprised of down at its DNA level? So when we did that, we found ourselves in some arboretums collecting reference tissue samples from Acer freemanii and also collecting genetic material from known pure red and known pure silver provenance. Basically, where does this campus mystery maple land in that grand scheme of things? Does it match up with it's just one of the parent trees, it just looks a little off? Or is it somewhere in that more gray hybrid land of a little bit of both?
Yeah, what a great mystery. Yeah, I'm dying to know the answer. I think we know the answer, but I'm really curious how this all unfolded. This is a great backstory.
Yeah, we know the answer. Somewhat naively, I assumed that it would be like crossing a UKC registered black lab with a UKC registered golden retriever and saying, yes, we have a golden lab or a lab retriever. It's 50% of both because I know mom and dad. I expected that we would have genetics that looks exactly like a 50-50 hybrid. And as our maple genomics consultant told us, your maples are a lot more promiscuous than that.
Right. And so you could potentially have multiple generations there, right? Are the hybrids sterile or can they reproduce as well?
Great question, Aaron. So, if we did more intensive sampling beyond our research trees, we'd be able to give a bit more of a reliable. This percentage of the hybrids are sterile. We do know that some are sterile.
Mm-hmm.
When we do a chromosomal count and we see odd numbers showing up, that's a pretty good indication that you've got a tree. Often it's a hepta, meaning 7. Often it's a 7 chromosome tree. With good confidence, that one will not be passing its genes on to the next generation.
Right.
Well over 90%, though, of that hybrid tree is coming back as a hexog chromosome, so 6 sets of chromosome across sort of that maple profile. And I think it's worth kind of talking a little bit about how we do genetics. The word genetics starts with the letter G. And if you wrote that in sort of a capital G form, go back to grade school and think about our, right, solid line, dashed middle line, solid line, and then you could even write your cursive in the basement, right? There's a way to sign in cursive a capital G and never go into the basement, but there's also a way to sign a capital G that does a big loop into the basement. It's a capital G, but it's written differently. When we look at DNA, we're looking for markers. How do I know that it's Aaron that wrote genetics? When the E, the N, the E, the T, the I, the C, the S looks relatively similar. How do you know when Gabe signed the G? Well, imagine that Aaron signs the G with the G that goes into the basement. I sign the G that stays firmly above it. That's a marker. That's a diagnostic marker. Most of the word looks similar. Most maple genetics are relatively similar, but there's key indicators that when we find them, we can use them as that diagnostic to say, nope, that was Aaron. Nope, that was Gabe. So unique markers signal to us when we're dealing with a red, when we're dealing with a silver, and other markers emerge as more prominently distinct when we're dealing with a hybrid. Same could be said for any other number of organisms on Earth. But as you may know, most DNA is quite similar given the breadth of diversity on Earth. We're looking for those diagnostic markers that really carve out that differentiation.
So you looked at these markers, and to circle back to your comment about the maples being more promiscuous than you previously thought, what did you find? What did that say about how these maples were interbreeding?
So there are not just reds, silvers, sugars, and hybrids. We, to date, have not found a pure parent red that matches our known red genetic material. Neither have we done the same in the natural woodlots for our silvers. At this point, and no, we haven't gone out and hugged every single maple tree on campus, but at this point, it seems we have 2 flavors, sugar maples and some soup pot concoction of hybrids of varying strains, some showing markers that show more of a red flare, some showing markers that show more of a heavy silver flare, but all of which are distinctly not true red or true silver.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that is not a result that I think a lot of people would expect. You'd expect to find reds, silvers, and then hybrids. So your study then, you chose to focus specifically on these naturally occurring hybrids in the woods for the maple production kind of questions?
That's right. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we installed a 1,200 tap operation, high vacuum tubing, 6 main lines. All the lanes converge on a single point, which is topographically at the bottom. And it's also fairly wet. In fact, 30 feet beyond the pump house, certain times a year and after a big thunderstorm, you've got sort of an intermittent creek that shows up, and you're sinking 2 to 4 inches into the ground. Not exactly premium Goldilocks sugar maple territory.
Right.
So when you map our main lines, which start in the bottom and then work their way up a northern exposure. So slope that faces north, we're getting into classic sugar maple range. You see our species composition switch from almost all red silver hybrids, Freemans, to a mix of both as we're going mid-slope. And when we're truly in the upland position, almost all sugar maples. So
Wow.
that in between grade, between like, hey, we're 25% of the way out and we're not quite to the upslope where it's a nice mix of both, that provides a wonderful kind of gradient to focus on. Hey, is one the gold standard sugar, or is the other also competitive in this sap production game that leads us to what we're all interested in, maple syrup? That's the question that we're really trying to attack at the single tree level.
Mm-hmm. So you had this system in place. It sounds like a nice system, by the way. Did you use the Cornell maple tubing notebook to design the system?
Well, again, remember how I came from the maple world. The folks that installed the maple tubing system knew about the Cornell notebook. I can assure you of that. I was still very much in the, I'm on a bucking horse and I don't really know what's happening yet. Wake me up when this is over and we'll see where we can take this. Yeah, it was very much a, if this is going to happen, it's going to happen yesterday. I hope it goes well. Thankfully, it has gone swimmingly. So, yes.
Okay, so you got this nice tubing system installed. And what did the study look like? Did you go out there and use vacuum canisters and do some sap collection?
That's exactly right. So our first year of production was 2018. We wrote a ACER grant, which got us in the woods collecting research on single trees on vacuum canisters in 2020, 21, and 22. So there was definitely a getting up to speed, just getting comfortable with a tubing production system. And for our third year, we took about 75 trees off of our production lines. We ran dedicated research lines out, and then we isolated sugar and Freeman's maples, who, except for the fact that they were different species, essentially looked identical to one another. All in the 10 to 12 inch diameter class, all with healthy crowns, one trunk, co-dominant or dominant position, yada, yada, yada. Part of what makes good research projects. Control the variation when you can. Allow the one factor that matters to drive the variation. In this case, which species are you?
And these were all on similar slope and aspect then?
Yep. It's a fairly homogeneous woods in terms of slope and certainly aspect. It's all sort of draining away to the north aspect. One of the big things that we focused on was the woods are natural regeneration following farmland and pasture abandonment.
Like so many sugar bushes.
That's exactly right. So when the private landowners in the 50s and 60s walked away from this parcel and it was acquired by the university, all those fields that have been pasture and farmed, all of a sudden, early succession takes off. And we know that certain species, pioneer species, those more adapted for wind-based dispersal, et cetera, are better suited to colonize those areas. Not really a surprise when you look around and see things like poplar and XYZ and this and that and the other. Not a whole lot of oaks and hickories, because at that point sort of takes a blue jay flying overhead to accidentally drop an acorn in order for regeneration to take place out in the middle of that old pasture. So yeah, a unique sort of legacy, but a legacy that's pretty consistent with, like you said, many of the sugar bushes that we find ourselves working in at the production level across the wider landscape.
Right. Yeah. So you collected multiple years of sap from these trees, and what did you see? Anything interesting?
Yeah, lots of interesting stuff. One really important thing that will kind of lay some groundwork for so what do I take away from this as a maple producer, is the concept of growing degree days. You're a tree, you've been sleeping all winter long, and there's a light knock on your door, and you don't hear it. And then another day, it knocks 3 times, or maybe it knocks 6 or 7 times, and it's a little bit louder, and you still don't hear it. But at some point, a certain number of knocks, so a certain amount of time spent above the temperature where you wake from winter dormancy and start metabolizing spring life, you wake up. It does not take as many knocks on the door to wake up red maples or silver maples, somewhere between 30 and 45 growing degree days, depending on the species that we're talking about. And our hybrid maples land right in the middle of that range. Sugar maples, for comparison, growing degree days are north of 100. What that means is growing degree days drive things like bud break, flowering, and ultimately green up phenology that we recognize as, hey, it's spring. So the concern of buddy sap and that sap flow slowing down is more of a concern when we're talking about these, hey, that's a maple species that's easier to wake up following dormancy than sugar maple, which thankfully for maple producers, quote, stays asleep longer, leaving it in that prime sap production time window for an additional couple of days, couple of weeks, depending on sort of the season conditions.
Okay, so we had some pretty warm weather during at least 2022, is that right? Did you see that reflected in the sap data, that those trees stopped producing sooner? Or did you boil the sap to know whether it was buddy sooner?
So when you talk about warm springs at your latitude, that's pushing your region towards potentially buddy sap. When we're talking warm springs in places like Kentucky, West Virginia, southern half of Pennsylvania, Ohio, we're not talking, hey, it was 52 degrees today. We're talking about second run of the year. It shut down because temperatures hit 68 or 72 degrees.
Right.
So while an age-old claim that, my season's over, buddy sap, I think oftentimes in my neck of the woods, that prognosis is not correct. What do we know goes downhill real quick when you're in the 60s and 70s?
Well, sap quality, certainly.
Absolutely,
Yep.
right? So for far more of our producers, certainly for our woods, it's hardly ever buddy sap that brings an end to our season. It's souring condition. It's sanitation concerns. That's just a difficult nut to crack when you're talking about first and second runs of the year in 3 out of the last 4 seasons that have ended. We're not talking, hey, the last run of the year ended when it was 70. We're talking, hey, we just got the taps in the trees, second run. Aren't you excited about the long syrup season that we have coming? And it's 70 degrees, right?
Wow.
You pretty much know what's going to shut that season down at that point. It's not going to be buddy sap. It's going to be sanitation concerns.
Okay. So does that mean that the fact that these trees wake more easily from dormancy doesn't matter quite so much then?
Probably so.
Okay.
And the reason I would say that is the amount of sap produced by the hybrids during run 1, 2, 3, 4, sort of that first half to 2/3 of the season, at least matches, if not significantly outperforms. This is just at how much water is leaking out of the tree, outperforms our sugar maples.
Okay.
That is not true in the last run or 2 or 3.
Okay. So they jump out to an early start.
Absolutely. So it's sort of like the Kentucky Derby. You see that horse out of the gate. Man, I'm glad I bet on that one. And then it's the one around the last turn that catches up and ultimately passes. That is absolutely how the sugar maple in our latitude retains the medal of horse track champion.
Mm-hmm.
If the season ended halfway into it, the prodigious sap flow output of our Freemans, even though the sap bricks isn't quite as high, would likely result in a tie or even a small besting of the sugar maple. It's the fact that you've got a sugar maple that can carry production an extra 2 or 3 runs, an extra 6 or 7 nights into that following day that ultimately gives sugar maple the season-wide advantage.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a pretty big difference in sap flow timing between these two species. I guess I'll ask you to speculate here a little bit before we look at more of your findings, but do you think that might be advantageous in your area to have trees that produce under different conditions?
It could. I purposefully said a couple things earlier in this podcast. I purposely said I honestly had no idea what was going on when we installed the tubing.
Mm-hmm.
I purposely said, no, I didn't really know what to expect when I got into this. Of course, at the grant proposal stage, I have very good hypotheses about what we're saying. But I didn't come into the maple research world having come from a long lineage of sugar makers who, for very good reasons, are tied to traditions, tied to what I heard from the older people in the sugar house telling me. I came to it from hey, show me the evidence tree and I'll form my opinion around that. What that sort of leads me to think is this. We, in some ways, lucked out with our sugar bush. What I didn't tell you is that across those 1,200 taps, we actually have a portion of our sugar bush that is 80-90% sugar maple, and it's older. It's an older stand. It's 80, 100 years old. It falls into that mature forest category. And sugar maples are not quite the early successional species that reds and silvers are. So we have one sugar bush, but there's really two compartments. The mature forest is more quintessential sugar maple dominated, with some sprinkling of that hybrid still in the lower reaches. But two main lines go up into a 6-acre naturally regenerated old pasture and farm field. And that species composition is more heavily loaded towards the hybrids. That tells me one thing, that A, as you go out a main line, if you're moving up and into more suitable Goldilocks sugar maple conditions, expect more sugar maples. But there's also distinct woodlots that simply because of their legacy are predisposed at an overall level to be dominated by more of the non-sugar maple composition. Meaning this, we have the option on our production lines to essentially turn the spigots off on main line 1 and 2 and keep the main lines open on 3, 4, 5, and 6, where 19 out of 20 trees are sugar maple. And they're still very willing to produce lots of sap if we haven't bumped into those sanitation conditions that we mentioned earlier. So clever tubing arrangement would give a producer some flexibility in terms of keeping some of their production up and going, others not. Of course, you've got to look at return on investment. If you need a certain amount of sap to turn that evaporator on again, or some sort of clever sap storage method, if now I got to have 2 days worth of sap on a smaller portion to justify going into the sugar house, but it does allow a producer to insert some within stand creativity that could help to have the best of both of those worlds.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I know that a lot of sugar makers attempt to do that, and myself included, based on microclimates. So my, more westerly, southern facing bushes tend to give up a little earlier, and I shut off the valves on those. But just thinking about composition or designing that into the system based on more than just microclimate might be something that sugar makers can take home and think about.
Certainly a consideration. And I do think there's something to be said here for buckets and bags.
Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm a big fan of
being
buckets.
Obvious. Take them down if it's not on a sugar maple. Leave it up if it is.
Right.
And certainly at those more northern latitudes where it's not likely sour sap that's ending in individual trees' season, it's buddy sap. That sort of outcome is absolutely doable. You have to take it down one way or another.
Right. Yeah, I'm a big fan of buckets. I like to have buckets in the woods so I know what's happening in the trees. You have to tap them a little later because the tap holes don't stay good as long, but that sure is a great way to find out what's happening in the trees.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so tell me more. Were there more interesting findings in this study?
Absolutely. Some of the work that has come out of the Northeast in recent years with red maples, essentially from a statistically significant perspective, commenting that heavier sap flow helps to compensate for the lower Brix levels, and there's not a significant over a season's production difference between sugar versus red. That's great research. We modeled a lot of what we did after a very similar research design. But again, we're talking Northeast, and we're talking a very different latitude down here. So even if we had been focused on pure reds, I would still argue there would be a reason to more or less clone the same work that has been done in other states, in other regions. But here's a couple, from my perspective, really interesting things. Historically, I've heard this said, you've heard this said, we've all heard it said, many of us may still say it: if it ain't a sugar maple, it ain't worth tapping.
We don't say that at Cornell.
We don't
But
say
I
that
hear
at
it.
Ohio State, but you still got plenty of producers suggesting that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
And I think behind a comment like that is the assumption that the distribution of individual sugar maples, so I'm holding my fingers up to form sort of a C shape, sort of a bracket. The distribution of sugar maples is way up here around my forehead, and the distribution of anything else in the woods is down here on my chest. And there's a wide gap between them, right? You've got your sugar maples, who are all the best. And then you've got all your other maples that are fighting for, whatever 117th place and down is.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's a great null hypothesis. Alternatively, sugar maples are still, on average, at least as good as, if not better than, but many of your other maples overlap the distribution.
Mm-hmm.
When we plot our distribution, and this is a great way to end a talk on this topic at a conference, is you simply ask producers if you knew across all your sugar maples which were the 50% best producers and which were the 50% worst. Right? If you've got 1,000 trees, give me the 500 best, the 500 worst. Would you only tap the 500 best?
Right. That's a great way to put it.
There's not a hand to be seen, right? No surprise.
Mm-hmm. You tap them all.
You tap them all. You follow that up by saying, well, at least half of all the other maples in your woods are better than half of the sugar maples that you're currently tapping.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we see. That top half of the other maples dance circles around the lower half of the sugar maples from a production standpoint. Now, the best of the best of the sugar maples are still your best trees. But the worst of your sugar maples do not hold a candle to the really healthy, vigorous growing other maples in your sugar bush.
Yeah. And that's a great lesson. That's one of the great things about this type of research. And it's something that I've gotten to experience firsthand, is just getting to know the variation between individual trees so well by going out and measuring the sap volume and the sugar content through the course of an entire season and seeing the just absolutely huge amount of variation that's out there in the woods.
Yeah, when you're just seeing sap come in the end of a main line or in a sap holding tank, all you know is, after a bricks measurement, how much syrup you get to sell. I would argue you know diddly squat about what happened in your woods.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's
now,
so
you can
true.
know between days, but on that given day, you don't know where that sap came from. You can have your hunches, but I think all of us who have done individual tree research had our hunches, and also had our hunches demolished, dismantled. There's lots of surprises out there.
Yeah, some of the trees that you think should be great producers, you look at them, they have a good diameter, they have a good crown, and just don't do that great. And sometimes you'll have that scrawny little tree that just really pumps out the sap with good sugar content. Usually that's not the case, but you have those exceptions.
Absolutely.
So, in other words, you tap the red maples, you tap the Freeman maples, you tap the silver maples.
That's right. And we're all familiar with the RO, reverse osmosis. It would have been a harder argument to make pre-RO. And I would say, for a producer without an RO, you will bring your bricks average down.
Right. You're talking about a difference like between maybe 2% and 1.8%, something like that.
That's right.
Which is not insignificant.
Which is not insignificant, particularly if you're chopping wood.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But if you're on RO, it's such a negligible difference that there's absolutely zero excuse not to be. There's some other reasons, though, why things like Freeman's maple need to enter the conversation. And I think everything I'm about to say also applies to a pure red or a pure silver. And it's the big elephant in the room, and it's climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Ohio is not exactly positioned at the heart of the sugar maples range.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean we're not going to have sugar maples in 50 or 100 years? Absolutely not. We will have sugar maples. But the surrounding environment won't necessarily be as conducive to those current trees' health, and certainly not for incoming cohorts of sugar maple regeneration into the future. Ask the same question about red maples, though. We're in the heart of their distribution. And not only that, the U.S. Forest Service has a wonderful, wonderful tool called the Forest Atlas. And it's a modeling attempt that has gone through multiple iterations that considers different factors associated with different trees. How good are they at dispersal? How well do they weather drought? Fill in the blank, all of the factors. Well over 125 eastern U.S. tree species have been modeled. And just like any good contest, there are winners and losers. Thankfully, at the distribution level, sugar maple is not a loser. Some of the earlier models suggested that the prognosis is pretty bad. That prognosis, with updated models and better information, that prognosis has mellowed, and the sugar maple future outlook for more northern latitudes doesn't look devastatingly catastrophic. But remember, in Ohio, we're at the southern fringe already today. So even if the future doesn't look too bad for sugar maples, we're already trying to do something on the fringe of where they're currently favored. But in any good contest, except a soccer game, it infuriates me that those can end in a tie. It doesn't take that long to do a shootout, people.
That's right. And that's the most exciting part of the game.
It's the most exciting part, right? Thankfully, hockey has figured that out, right? After an overtime, we go to shootout. There is only one winner, and you sort out those 125, 130 trees. The blue ribbon winner at the state fair for future resiliency in the face of whatever the future will throw at us is red maple. Silver maple is comparable to sugar maple's resilience, but when you couple the best in the biz with a pretty moderate resilience, it's not too much of a leap intellectually to assume that Acer freemanii is somewhat well positioned to be resilient in whatever our southern latitude future looks like, and likely favor better than sugar maples, particularly when we look in the understory at what 100 years from now's forest will be. We do not see near as much sugar maple regeneration as we do red maple regeneration. We have lots of reasons to believe that you should be hedging your bets for the future. And hedging your bets in our neck of the woods means diversifying maples.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you steered us right into the climate conversation because
we have to.
Right. And I think that is the topic of conversation right now for many of us. And, in reading about your project and thinking about Freeman's maple, that was the context I was thinking in. And I have so many questions, and I know we have limited time here, but just a few that pop into my head immediately are Freeman's maples maybe especially well adapted to climate when we think about the big picture of flood followed by drought? I mean, red maples are really well adapted to both. Silver maples have that kind of fibrous, shallow rooting system that works really well in a wetland area, but maybe would be more prone to blowdowns and things like that. But so just thinking about all the different factors that come at us with climate change, how do you think Freeman's maple will fare overall?
What a fantastic question. I would probably have to chew on that to articulate a really good response. But yes, silver maples, they are ideal for wet sites, places where water stands around a bit longer than most other tree species prefer. What we know about the future? We're going to have roughly the same amount of rain around here, but it's going to come in increasingly flashier pulses. Meaning, if you get 52 inches of rain a year, you're not going to get 1 inch per week for the entire year, right? It's going to be a bit more episodic. A tree that can tolerate standing in water a bit more, it's going to do better. But you absolutely wouldn't want to say, well, since silver maple's really tolerant of wet conditions, we probably need to hedge our bets around silver maple. Well, what else do we know? Extreme weather events are going to become more frequent. So if more frequent storms with greater possibility of limb snapping and wind throw and tip ups, I want a deeper rooted tree with better form and structure, like a red maple. Well, it sounds like you're talking about a Freeman's maple, right? And we could follow that line of logic further and probably identify a few more factors that suggests, yeah, it probably is a good arrow in the quiver of future resiliency.
Yeah, and that was where I went, just thinking about it as someone that knows not very much about Freeman's maple. You throw in the fact that we're going to experience more droughts. And if you get that characteristic from the red maple, along with the more extreme level of standing groundwater tolerance from the silvers, what a great tree that could be.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that we enjoy in this part of the country are really long growing seasons and trees with the right conditions that can grow really, really fast. On campus, again, as part of the Woodland Stewards extension platform, we have a dozen or 15, 1 to 5 or 10 acre demonstration areas where we can teach a landowner about a practice, say, controlling grapevines or managing a forest for crop trees. And we have a 6-acre crop tree with a control. We've identified our controls, but we have not released them. A 2-sided and a 4-sided. So identify the trees that you want to favor and then take out their neighbors so that they have more growing space. And you can do that on 1, 2, 3, or 4 sides. We chose to go, know what trees you like, but ignore them, 2-sided and 4-sided. We're about 5 years into this. They're all Freeman's maples. They're all between 45 and 50 years old that popped up in another one of those abandoned pastures. And the current trees are anywhere between 8 and 14 inches, meaning on the low side, we grew an 8-inch diameter tree at breast height in 40 years. On the upside, we grew a 13 or a 14-inch tree in 4.5, 5 decades. All of them, though, are packed in there tight. You cut a tree down, that last decade or two of growth rings have really constricted. The stand is overstocked. We went in, and that woods is not tubed, but we did hang buckets, and we looked at control versus 4-sided. But the most interesting thing to come out of it was when we think about sugar bush management, being a good steward of not only keeping your forest a forest, but paying attention to the health and the vigor of the individual trees within it. You wouldn't say, hey, I've got a 10 by 10 patch of raised bed garden. I want a lot of tomatoes. I'm going to plant 1,000 plants, right? You're better off saying, how much room can I give each plant to have the biggest tomatoes and the most tomatoes on the least amount of vines? It's a much better approach, not only for count, but also quality. So we don't want to understock a stand, but there's absolutely a balance to be achieved by not just saying, hey, all the trees that are here currently, they can just fight it out until they figure out who should be the winner. It is absolutely a good practice for the landowner to say, you look like you're already doing better, and I can identify weaknesses with your neighbor. Let's just go ahead and fast forward what nature may take 5 or 15 years to work out by herself. Let's get the job over with. Remarkably, years 1, 2, and 3, you look at sap volume, sap bricks, or tree growth rates, not a huge increase. And that makes sense. Just because you cut down a tree's neighbor doesn't instantly mean the tree's canopy goes from being shaped like a narrow Y to a dum-dum lollipop, right? But as that happens, years 4 and 5, not only did we see the 4-sided release trees pass significantly in terms of sap flow and sap bricks, in the last 2 years, our 4-sided release trees have put on average, over a half inch of diameter growth every year.
Yeah, that's pretty phenomenal. And in that basal area increment is the thing that's most closely associated with making more syrup.
That's exactly right. Almost a linear and strongly positive relationship between how big is your tree and how much sap does it produce. The fastest way to get on that track is to give your tree room to grow. Now, I will say in parentheses, you did not hear me say go out and do a four-sided release in your entire sugar bush.
Mm-hmm.
We were designing things for sort of maximum effect. You do that and you have a severe storm, a tree that's used to having neighbors, before it kind of grows into itself, is going to be more susceptible to things like wind throw. So a slower approach of maybe two sides in year one, and then coming back and addressing the other two sides of competition in like a year 5 or a year 7 or a year 10 is a way to extend that benefit, but also not take a big gamble that you're sacrificing stand health to try and get as much out of individual tree vigor as possible. So there's some balance there, but realize that's sort of an experimental design that we're pretty happy with so far.
Yeah, that's a interesting result. It's something we've seen in a similar study in a more mature forest. And I guess it's not surprising, right? The tree's first response should be to compete for that sunlight and direct their resources toward growing, not building a carbohydrate reserve. But once they fill that canopy, they've got access to more sun and they can make more sugar.
That's right. It's definitely not a surprise, but you will hear foresters saying, hey, is crop tree management a good idea for my woods? Man, those trees are 40, 50 years old. They're kind of grown into like a suppressed, stagnated, slower growth rate. You should have done your crop tree release 20, 30 years ago. And that may be true. You should have done it 20, 30 years ago. I always heard it's a waste of time to do it now. That is simply not the case.
Right. It might be a slower response, but you could do a commercial thinning if the trees are bigger and get some value out of your woods in the process.
Absolutely. And if you've got a wood-fired evaporator, sort of a no-brainer. If you're already in an NRCS program like EQIP and you're into wildlife, you can repurpose the slash as cost-shared brush piles and other sorts of things. If you're having issues with deer consuming all of your maple regeneration in sort of a microcosm, you can arrange that slash to protect a couple pockets of maple, or maybe you've got one white oak that's been trying to regenerate an acorn into an oak seedling for years and years. Like, be creative, turn those downed trees into something useful. There's lots of possibilities out there.
Yeah, that's a really great thing to point out there about thinning the sugar bush. I think that's something we don't think about nearly enough as sugar makers, is just those active steps we need to take to keep our woods healthy and growing and productive for the long term. I'll ask you a final question, if I may. This is thinking a little bit outside of the box, so hopefully it's in your lane. So thinking about future sugar bushes for people that don't have access to a good sugar bush and they're thinking about maybe creating a legacy woods that can be tapped in the future, should they be thinking about maybe planting Freeman's maple, or maybe planting some silver maples and red maples and letting nature run its course?
It's an interesting question. Certainly, as far as we humans were aware, we thought we came up with the Freeman's maple, right?
Right.
Turns out Mother Nature had been hybridizing some species for quite some time. But it does bring up the question of, if you've got an open space that you would like to turn into a forest and sugar bush production is what you're thinking about, it's an option that should be considered. Now, as a scientist, as a researcher, we're always quick to point out the leaps of logic. One leap of logic is these are nature's version of Freeman's maple. These are naturally occurring red silvers. And while I don't have any reason to believe that an autumn blaze cultivar out of a plant nursery wouldn't look similar in terms of sap production characteristics, I cannot guarantee that that is the case.
Right. Maybe those genetics that are tied to great leaf color are also related to sugar content.
Exactly. In some
like
way,
right?
Nature has sprinkled in just a little something extra that they didn't account for in the Arboretum of old. I don't know that. I would say that when you start thinking about Freeman's maples, red maples, definitely silver maple if you're in a situation where their adaptability would be favorable at your site-specific location. You're talking about tree species that grow real fast. And the single mistake that I think most of us have probably seen with most tree plantations is that when they're a sapling or a seedling, they look really small. And the temptation is to plant a few more than the best practice guidance book said. Well, if it says 8 by 8, man, that's a long ways between neighbors. I mean, 6 by 6 won't hurt. Well, I can tell you that real quickly, you'll be wondering, why didn't I just follow the manual? Whatever those numbers are, and I don't know what they are off the top of my head, treat them as very conservative. This is how much distance you should have between them when we're talking about a tree hybrid that is growing on an incredibly accelerated pace. Yeah, play the give them a little bit more room option rather than can I stick another one in there and get away with it? Probably not.
Yep, that's just more work to put them in the ground and more work to cut them out of there when the time comes.
That's right.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot more questions that we can research about Freeman's maple. So I'm glad that you're doing this work. Really appreciate your time today. This has been really fascinating, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it again in the future.
Would love to come back on at some point, Aaron. And again, I really appreciate the invitation. If someone does want to track me down and ask more questions, I'm sure you could get to me through Aaron, or you could send me an email at my last name, Karns, Karns .36, KARNS.36 at OSU.edu.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that, Gabe. We really appreciate it. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. It's been a pleasure.
Well, Adam, it was interesting to hear about Gabe's work with Freeman's maple. And it sounds like there's a lot of potential for it to play a role in syrup production, especially in a changing climate.
Yeah, it was a really interesting discussion that you had. And I would agree that the Freemans sound like they have a lot of great potential for maple syrup production. I like that they are very adaptable to different growing conditions, wet soils, dry soils, and that they're a really fast growing tree that has, potential for great syrup production if it's a tree that's growing fast. And especially, if you're thinking about areas of actually going in and planting a tree too. And that's kind of what I was thinking with the trees that I planted here at the Eline Forest was planting the Freeman's maple because they're a fast growing tree, but yet a little more structurally sound than the silver maples where they don't break apart as easily. So, there's lots of great information thinking about our forests. I love that your conversation went beyond just focusing on, what's overall sap production within these trees, but what we need to think about to keep these healthy, resilient forests in changing climates or different weather patterns.
Yeah, and you and I both have forestry backgrounds. Not all sugar makers do. So I think it's important to keep this conversation going in the sugaring community to think about sugar bush health and think about our sugar bushes as ecosystems, right? So we're stressing out these ecosystems with climate change, changes in soil chemistry when we lose species like we did with ash, insect populations that are changing in response to a changing climate and introduced species and things like that. Those have ripple effects through the whole system. So we really need to think about how to keep the whole system healthy. Diversity is part of it. Having maple trees with this different physiological characteristics are part of it. And just thinking about how we want to actively manage with all those things in mind is just really important. I've been looking out at our woods and we see how we're losing all this ash. 20% of our forest is ash. And in those gaps right now that are opening up, we're getting multiflora rose, honeysuckle, garlic mustard, and things like that. So there are a lot of things that are changing that just cry out for active forest management. So having a species like Freeman's maple that we could potentially use for reforestation or to select for it when we do thinning in our woods is really important.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that active forest management is maybe different now. And there's a lot I think we need to learn than what it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that, now we're losing different species, but also, you talked with Gabe about thinning trees and, how thinning can be great. And I think Gabe even brought up about, well, you may not want to over thin. And I think that's especially true now with like more extreme wind events. And so I think there's different things for some of these forest management aspects that we still need to learn or need to think about, work on nutrient and fertilizers or adding lime into our forest to get the calcium up or pH change could be even more important now just because these trees are maybe a little more stressed. And so if we can try to reduce some of the stresses on the trees so that when we get a big storm event or wind event or we have an invasive insect comes through, that they can maybe kind of bounce back a little bit easier.
Yeah, and that's really the key point here is that, we have a lot of forests in New York State and throughout the Northeast and Midwest. We have an increasing amount of forests, but what is the quality of the trees within those forests? Are they healthy, fast-growing trees? And that's really needs to be our objective, to have a healthy, productive sugar bush. And right now, we're having a lot of signs that that's going to be more and more difficult in the future. So a lot of our sugar maples are mature, and they're reaching the point where they're starting to die out. So we need to think about maintaining those as well as we can and the health of the future stand. And just to add one more point to what you said, talking about thinning is, I went to forestry school, practiced forestry for a long time, and textbook forestry just doesn't work in a lot of situations anymore because of some of the factors you mentioned related to climate change, more extreme weather events, and also just white-tailed deer populations. We can't go into a woods and just thin it and expect to get regeneration on the forest floor. It doesn't happen because there are too many deer out there. So there are things that we need to look at more closely. There's a lot of new research coming out for how to keep forests healthy in the face of climate change and in the face of heavy deer browse. So we really need to integrate that knowledge into our sugar bush management knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And we mentioned at the top of the episode is thinking about that diversity. We're not just talking about diversity of maple species, but also that diversity of non-tappable maple trees that we know that is going to create generally a healthier forest ecosystem and that it creates a diversity within the soil ecosystem as well by having different species because there's different microbiota that we're learning more and more about that prefer different types of species to live on, and that creates healthier, more resilient soils for your trees at large, but also different species. Like if you've got cherry trees or birch trees and you get eastern tent caterpillar that comes in, they're going to attack those trees before they're going to go after your maple. So having that diversity of species is really important. And generally, we will like to see at least 20 to 30% non-maple species within our forest, right, Aaron?
Yeah, that's right. Those are kind of the standard forest management guidelines is 25% is a good target of non-maple species. And that's not number of trees, that's biomass. So 25% of the biomass in the woods should be other species kind of distributed somewhat evenly through the woods. Or if you've got a smaller woods, if you've got a lot of biodiversity around your main sugar bush, that's usually adequate to help prevent big insect outbreaks and things like that.
Yeah, and that's, in each forest is going to be a little different. Some forests are just naturally heavier in maple production, but you do what you can to work with. Just don't go out there and cut down every birch tree and oak tree and cherry tree to just leave maple. Leave that diversity sprinkled throughout your forest if you can.
Yeah, and that really reminds me, as we discuss this, that forestry is a science, and it's a fairly complex one. And it's not one that you might want to necessarily take on yourself if you don't have that background in forestry. So if you're unsure, I would definitely recommend talking to a forester. Not a lot of foresters know a lot about sugar bush management, but most of the principles of good forest management also apply to sugar bush management. And in addition to that, we have a lot of resources available both at Cornell and elsewhere that we can point to. Adam, can you mention some of those resources for our listeners?
Yeah, definitely. So one resource on our website is the Cornell Maple Program Sugar Bush Management Notebook. That's at cornellmaple.com under our notebook series. We have a whole sugar bush management guideline that's out there. You can also reach out to your, generally each state has a forest extension specialist that you can reach out to through Land Grant University. Here in New York, we have a forestry extension program that's called Forest Connect, and there's a whole website with lots of different resources. They have a monthly webinar, and all those are recorded and available online on their website at Forest Connect. So that is a great resource to check out. And there's lots of fact sheets and information out there as well.
Yeah, and the Forest Connect program, forestconnect.com, is run by the former director of the Cornell Maple Program, Dr. Peter Smallage, and he knows a lot about maple, so he can be really helpful for sugar bush management. And last but not least, you've got Adam and I. We both have backgrounds in forestry, and if you have questions, you can reach out to us directly And if we don't know the answer, we at least know where to point you to get the answer to your forest management questions.
Yeah, definitely. We love hearing from folks and hearing what questions and issues you have within your maple operation, and help you to answer what we can or point you in the right direction to keep you sugaring along.
Yeah, we love forests. We love talking about forests, so definitely reach out to us. And I suspect we'll be hearing a lot more about Freeman's maple over the coming years, so we'll be sure to talk about that and other sugar bush management topics on future episodes of Sweet Talk, All Things Maple.
Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, All Things Maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.